exciting to kind of share this really fascinating story that we don't get to tell all that much, or we don't know this story all that well. For a show of hands, how many of you have been to the G.W. Frank Museum here in town? Wonderful. Okay, this is great. And if you haven't, I highly recommend taking some time and visiting us on campus, right? We're on West Campus, where the very distinctive Gilded Age mansion kind of stands out on campus. And this is, one of those really impressive homes and historic sites here in our community. But it has a story connected to it that connects to the heart of the American dream, the heart of the American story, and the fight for liberty for all. And so I want to begin in and amidst the Civil War. On January 31st, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment. This is the handwritten copy of the 13th Amendment that is signed by all members of the House after its passage. And the amendment is notable for its impact and its brevity. It ended enslavement except in cases of incarceration in the United States and just consists of 2 articles. Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This was the culmination of decades of activism by abolitionists, by blacks, by reformers, and activists of political stripes, varied and confusing and complex, and pressured by the untold numbers of newly freed people who were coming into the contraband camps at the Union lines and who were making a cause and a claim for their liberation, for their freedom. And the amendment then ensured American victory in that Civil War, meant an end to enslavement and an end to racial slavery. But passage of this amendment was by no means assured, but necessary to end enslavement. Following the successful passage in January, newspapers across the country identified the 2 congressmen specifically for the passage of this act. To 2 Republicans in particular does the nation owe a debt of gratitude, to James and M. Ashley of Toledo, Ohio, and Augustus Frank of Warsaw, New York. They held the laboring oar. Now, if you've seen the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, you might be familiar with James Ashley. I'm going to show you an image of him later in this talk, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that guy from that movie. But Augustus Frank's story is less told. And there's some reasons behind that, and I'll kind of point you to them and discuss why that is in the course of this conversation. But I want to introduce you further to the Frank family. And you might be somewhat familiar if you've been to the G.W. Frank Museum, as most of you have. You're somewhat familiar with this story. And Augustus then might be familiar. Augustus is George Washington Frank's older brother. And also, as we'll see, a key member in the development of Kearney later in life. Congressman Frank's stewardship of the 13th Amendment is little known due to the secretive efforts of lobbying, right? This is not something that is recorded as you're twisting arms and making favors and probably, doing what you need to do. There's not a record of what you're doing. Yet it's only a part of the Frank family story during the Civil War and their decades-long fight to end enslavement. And so we're going to talk about the family, we're going to talk about their cousins, and we're going to talk about a wide range of people in their orbit and their impact on Kearney more largely. But this is the Frank family, Dr. Augustus Frank, and then Jane Patterson Frank, who are the parents of Congressman Frank, and then George Frank here. So this is the gentleman who builds the house over on the west side of town. And it's important to remember that Jane is a member of the Patterson family who will also be part of our conversation. And this history begins far and away from our little museum on UNK's campus. And it begins in the small community of Warsaw in western New York. And just to kind of familiarize yourself with that, this is where Warsaw's at. It's kind of southeast of Buffalo, not far from Lake Ontario. And they are a very influential family in this community, as we're going to see. In 1817, Dr. Augustus Frank, father to both George and then his namesake Augustus, settled in Warsaw. He was a teacher who then became a doctor and then entered the mercantile business in Warsaw. And he also did a lot of real estate transactions and was able to accrue a not insignificant amount of wealth in his community and soon developed other enterprises. He owned a flour mill, he owned iron mills, textile plants, and other industries in New York as well as Michigan, where some of his in-laws had settled. At the time that the Franks were living in Western New York, where Warsaw is located, it's known as the Burnt Over District, okay? Because of the religious and reformist fervor that is coming out of this area. This is a part of the country, this is where the Millerite tradition, what will later be the Seventh-day Adventist faith comes from. It's also where the Latter-day Saints will emerge out of Palmyra, which is part of this part of the country. It's also where temperance and abolition are really going to take hold in the early 19th century. And it's referred to as the burned over district because of the fire of reform and religion that just blazes through this part of the country. And Dr. Augustus Frank is wealthy. He is well respected in the community. He builds a large home. There is a Frank home in Warsaw today. This is the family home. It is still there, just off kind of the main traffic circle in the center of the community. This is where Augustus and then George Washington Frank spent their childhood. It's a very nice, beautiful home now. It's a number of different businesses, but a very prominent and critical space within their community. And in addition to being a wealthy businessman and a respected leader in the community, Augustus Frank is an ardent abolitionist. Very early on, the Anti-Slavery Society is formed in Warsaw in 1833. According to the town's history written in 1869 by a friend of Augustus, a gentleman by the name of Andrew W. Young, quote, "In a few parts of the country did the anti-slavery sentiment earlier or more strongly prevail than in this town." So very early on, we're 30 years before the Civil War, the abolition has really kind of taken hold in this community and an advocacy for the end of enslavement. And among those early abolitionists was Dr. Augustus Frank. And he was an advocate for immediate abolition. There's a lot of flavors of abolition in the 19th century. Some advocate for gradual abolition, that if we free the children of enslaved men and women, the process will eventually die out. There's advocates of immigration, that if we remove formerly enslaved people to Africa, that would be the end to enslavement. Others are calling for payments that the federal government should pay enslavers to free the men, women, and children that they own. But Gus Frank Dr. Augustus Frank is of the most radical, which is end it right now. No money, no other exchange will be made. You end it right now. Okay. On October 3rd, 1835, an invitation to a state convention of immediate emancipation advocates appeared in William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, which was, again, the most radical anti-slavery newspaper in the United States in this time period. The convention aimed to create an anti-slavery society statewide across New York for those who were committed to immediate abolition. And among those listed on the membership rolls are Augustus Frank here from Warsaw, as well as his brother-in-law, William Patterson, the brother of Jane. William will later be a member of Congress. He'll be elected as a Whig in 1836. He will also serve as Lieutenant Governor of New York. So he comes from a very, very, very well connected family. So following this, they called a meeting to be held in Utica, New York, and Augustus Frank was a delegate at that meeting, representing the Warsaw Anti-Slavery Society. The meeting was really controversial as they're beginning to advocate for immediate ends to abolition. The city's mayor called a town meeting to oppose the abolitionists and had local businesses and business leaders. They formed their own anti-abolition association, okay? So a pro-slavery organization. A mob of anti-abolitionists stormed the meeting, but they were outnumbered by the abolitionists there 4-1. They tried to shout down the abolitionists and disrupt the meeting, but the abolitionists calmly called the meeting to a close. They still followed Robert's Rules of Order and then left. But unfortunately for us, for the historical record, one of the anti-abolitionist writers did steal the meeting minutes. So we don't actually, unfortunately, know what Dr. Frank might have said at this meeting because of those anti-abolitionist forces. The following meeting, there was another meeting in Batavia of the Genesee County Anti-Slavery Society, which Dr. Frank also attended, which was similarly disrupted by a mob of anti-abolitionists. The mob labeled the abolitionists fanatics who threatened the stability of the nation. But this did not in any way whatsoever deter the Franks. When the group reconvened in Warsaw the following week, Dr. Frank pledged significant personal funds to create an abolitionist newspaper, okay, to further spread the word of what he was articulating. And this was known as The American Citizen, which was published in Warsaw and then moved around Western New York for a couple of years before finally settling in Rochester. And this newspaper is a little fragmented, so there's not a lot of surviving copies. On November 13th, 1839, a meeting of the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society held in Warsaw forwarded the creation of a national abolitionist political party, what will be known as the Liberty Party, kind of the first major single-issue third party in the United States. As my former colleague, Vern Volpe in the history department, who is surprisingly one of the leading experts on the Liberty Party. It's just kind of amazing how this story kind of fits together. Wrote an entire book on the Liberty Party, but he writes, by casting a Liberty ballot, concerned Christians separated themselves from the sins through thought that infected much of antebellum America. So he writes about how the Liberty Party was very much a moral position, very much a political position, very much a new position for a lot of people to take. But this is something that the Franks are very involved in. We also know, based on surviving kind of material, that it's not just supporting a newspaper, it's not just supporting and attending meetings, that they are also taking direct action to end enslavement. This is an oral history that was taken in 1894 by an elderly resident of Wyoming County, where they are at. And in it, Dr. Augustus Frank is identified as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, indicating or suggesting that the Franks themselves are directly participating in the liberation of enslaved peoples in upstate New York. As you'll see, this is the actual text of the oral history, where it identifies Andrew Young, who's a friend of Augustus Frank, Dr. Augustus Frank, and a couple others who, that the fugitives, that they were supporting people who were moving on their way north and ultimately to Canada, okay? Now, this is the recollections of someone who is recording a community rumor 30 years and 40 years after the fact in this case, and so we can't definitively, again, demonstrate that the Frank family are conductors on the Underground Railroad. Again, it's a secretive organization. They're not keeping a lot of records. That's the point. And so we kind of just have to read between the lines on some of these things. But where they are at, we do have some surviving maps and some other things that kind of tell us about the history of the Underground Railroad. And they are, again, Warsaw is up here in upstate New York, just off of Buffalo. And so this is a key route that people are facilitating, going through Buffalo and then crossing over into the Canadian border and obtaining freedom. So it is. We can conjecture, we can speculate, but it is possible that the Franks are bringing enslaved peoples through this network. Now, they wouldn't be doing this with their home in town, but we know that the Franks are real estate magnates in Wyoming County, so they certainly have access to tenants and farms and other places in rural parts that they might be able to hide someone in a barn or hide someone. And so, we unfortunately can't quite understand, again, this reality. But we understand too, though, from some surviving material, that members of the Frank family do see active involvement to end enslavement, not just meetings, not just creating newspapers, as something to be respected or something that is reasonable. There's another abolitionist who's from upstate New York, who will cause some controversy in the immediate preceding moments of the Civil War, and that is John Brown, leading his raid on Harper's Ferry. We don't have not really told the history of abolition at the House. It's not something that's in the tour. It's not something that's all that well documented, unfortunately, in the records that we do have at the House. But we do have an object that hints at this history at the House. And this is George Frank's personal copy of the biography of John Brown. And so this text was written by a colleague of John Brown shortly after his execution by the United States government following the failed raid on Harper's Ferry, but it does have George Frank's Warsaw, New York inscription on the inside, and we do have this at the House. So suggesting at least that following John Brown's raid, following these kind of early moments of the Civil War, that there was, again, this continued interest, and that it wasn't just something for Dr. Augustus Frank, it was also something that fell upon the children. And to that, we now want to turn to Gus Frank. Gus Frank is the one who's going to be involved in the 13th Amendment. He's going to have this really relatively short, but important political career. He is the eldest of the Frank children. He follows his father into the mercantile business. He gets involved in banking. He stays involved in real estate. He gets involved with the railroad, and is a member of the Whig Party, which is one of the two dominant political parties in this time period, but is also fairly outspoken in his disdain for enslavement. He would be elected the Wyoming County Whig County Chairman before he could vote. He's 18 and he's elected the county party chair. Mind you, you can't vote until you're 21 in this time period. So he is very early on a political operative in his community, and is known as an eloquent speaker. He's known as an ardent advocate for Whig policies and Whig politicians. He gives a speech in 1848 for Zachary Taylor when he's running for election, and so very quickly kind of enters into the political fray in upstate New York. And he will join, along with a great many Whigs, the nascent Republican Party in 1855. Okay, so the Whig Party collapses, and out of that remnants, a great many of the ardent anti-slavery forces that were within the Whig Party join and create what will become the Republican Party, which Gus joins fairly quickly in 1855. He will be elected a delegate to the first Republican National Convention, okay, that will nominate John C. Fremont for the presidency in 1856, an election that John C. Fremont will lose. But he will continue in this advocacy and will be ultimately elected to Congress as a Republican in 1858, taking his seat in 1859. And in part of his political career, we have some surviving correspondence. This is a letter where from 1848 where he's listed as one of the signatories on this petition in Warsaw. And he is an ardent supporter of Abraham Lincoln when Abraham Lincoln 2 years later ultimately claims the Republican nomination in 1860. And we have surviving material from the local press that kind of talks about Augustus Frank and his relationship and his advocacy for President Lincoln. During the election, many of the young people who were supporters of Abraham Lincoln aligned themselves under the organization known as the Wide Awakes. Which was kind of the cool young Abraham Lincoln supporters. And this is what a wide awake looked like. A wide awake would wear like a rain cape, okay, and then carry around a torch in the middle of the night. They would march through towns, and we have newspaper evidence that Augustus is donating barrels of oil to the local wide awakes so that they can march around town with their torches, proclaiming Abraham Lincoln's candidacy and support for him. He was also in 1860 up for re-election, and so aligned himself kind of to this new innovative candidate that's coming out of the Republican Party, and is frequently stumping for Abraham Lincoln's policies all throughout upstate New York. One of the rallies that we have documented, which is in this newspaper clipping here from Warsaw, Gus addresses a crowd of 2,500 people, and there are 460 torch-carrying wide awakes in the audience. Okay, so you can imagine the effect that you would have. You've got 2,500 people, and then just shy of 500 young people with torches, kind of in and amongst the crowd. On August 29th, 1860, Augustus Frank will also give a speech in support of Abraham Lincoln. He will be reelected here in 1860. This is a photo of Augustus Frank when he's in Congress. He addressed the Washington, D.C. Republican Association in May of 1860 following Abraham Lincoln's nomination at the Republican National Convention, as well as the nomination of the Senator from Maine, Hannibal Hamlin, as the vice president. In his address, Frank contrasted the platforms of the Democratic and Republican parties, attacked slavery, and affirmed New York's support for Abraham Lincoln, New York being a Republican stronghold at this point. And in this address, he says, "I will with my utmost confidence say that New York will not be found wanting. She will discharge her whole duty, and the 35 electoral votes of the Empire State will be given for honest old Abe Lincoln of Illinois. Our party is young, vigorous, and prepared to administer the government, while the Democratic Party totters upon the brink of disillusion and slavery propagandism. Slavery has demanded that within the slave states, the constitutional rights of inhabitants of free states should be ignored. The most shameful outrages have been perpetrated against the rights and personal liberties of northern citizens traveling in slave states or residing there, that too many times with the full sanction and approval of public authorities, free speech has been denied, insult has been heaped upon, and at times the most brutal treatment. They have been compelled to submit to almost every indignity, imprisonment, tar and feathering, punishment by stripes, and in many cases been driven from the slave states. Not only have northern citizens suffered such indignities, but whole communities, men respected for their obedience to law, their quiet and inoffensive lives, and their industry have with their families been exiled from their homes because they did not consider slavery a blessing and were unwilling to give up their long cherished convictions. The threats of dissolution of this union, so made of late, all come from the same party. Sometimes it grieves me to hear them, as it does every lover of this country. At other times I move to laughter, so puerile and contemptible they seem to be. Poor, impotent men without power to even make a blade of grass grow, threatening to render asunder this union cemented by the blood of Christians and patriots and watched over by an all-wise being, who alone can set up and destroy kingdoms and nations. I am glad to say that such threats have proved unavailing. They were exacting in their demands for the protection and preservation of slavery, even to giving up on our part of all independence, including freedom of speech, thought, and action." Upon the conclusion of this address, the audience, including Augustus Frank, presumably, took to the street behind the Marine Band, who then marched up to the hotel where the vice presidential candidate was saying, and from the balcony then, the future vice president addressed the crowd. Now, he's only a one-term congressman at this point. He has been successfully reelected and will be starting his second term. But he has gained some influence in this early Republican Party quite quickly. And so we get some sense of where he is politically. He will run for re-election in 1860 and 1862. This is a photo of Augustus Frank by Matthew Brady, who is the famous kind of Washington, D.C. Civil War photographer. Many of the great photos of Abraham Lincoln are taken by Matthew Brady. We see here one of the printed ballots that ran in the Warsaw paper, where we see at the top Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin, but then below, kind of the local candidates at the very bottom, Augustus Frank. And again, he comes from this very well-established and well-connected family. He will be very involved in Congress. He's the chairman of the Library of Congress Committee. And in his last term from 1862 to 1864, he is the chairman of the congressional delegation from New York. So he's the leading New York delegate in Congress. We get again, he's spending a lot of time with Matthew Brady. We have a lot of surviving photos of Augustus Frank kind of in his time as a congressman. These are all at the Library of Congress, as well as this set of photos also by Matthew Brady from his time in Congress. This is the speech that he gives for Hamlin that I just read to you from, that is reprinted and distributed around the nation, so that the words of Augustus Frank can be shared by others, and that there are others who also speak as part of the nomination of the vice president. And he has Again, a really well-connected family. He's very, very close to his Patterson cousins, who are also very involved politically. Some of them get elected to Congress. His uncle serves as the governor of New York, and we have actually a surviving letter from to one of them where he talks about his support for Abraham Lincoln. And in it he writes, "I am pleased with the president. He seems anxious to do his duty, and I think is perfectly honest. He has a great responsibility and the needs and good wishes and aid of all loyal men. Little is said about our last act, abolishing slavery here." This was the abolishment of slavery in Washington, D.C., "but in communication with the emancipation message of the president." And so the effort to end enslavement in Washington, D.C. is overshadowed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but in this letter he is telling his uncle how much he supports Abraham Lincoln and the work that he is doing. Now, with the outbreak of hostilities during the war in 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter, and then that summer, the Battle of the First Bull Run, Augustus Frank very, very quickly, even though he is telling us in May of 1860, the war is not going to happen, it's just a threat, we will not have disunion, that does ultimately, as we all know, come about. And so very quickly he turns to becoming a wartime congressman, advocating for his constituents and supporting them, as a great many young men in Wyoming County and in Warsaw in particular do enlist in the United States Army and march south to participate in those conflicts. And we have a lot of kind of evidence of this kind of era in his career. We know that both Augustus Frank and George Washington Frank are providing money to local men who are going. In July of 1861, he rushed to the Bull Run battlefield to check on all of the local units from Wyoming County. Again, the first Battle of Bull Run is just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and so people actually go and picnic during the battle so that they can watch it. And then they realize that there is a war going on, and it is a war. He found everyone safe and sound despite their presence in the thickest fighting, and he tells, writing back to the local paper, "It is a sad day here, but I trust I may never see the like again," he wrote to the Western New Yorker. The local press indicated that those flooding into D.C. could talk to Augustus Frank, who was working night and day to locate wounded brothers and cousins and siblings, is written here in one of the local papers. "In these hospitals, there are between 20 and 30,000 sick and wounded men, and the first questions which they naturally ask is, 'Where in all of this city of affliction is my boy, my brother, or my husband?' Many of the members, too, are diligent night and day, serving their constituency in this way, including the Honorable Augustus Frank." And so what we know, based on this, is he's going from hospital to hospital to find those local men from Wyoming County, connect them to their relatives who have taken the train or the stage down from New York and who are looking for them in this early moment in the battle. And there are members of the extended family who will then themselves participate in the Civil War that Gus is well aware of. William Patterson, who is Jane Frank's brother, has a son by the name of William W. Patterson, who is orphaned at an early age. His father was a Whig congressman who died, and then 2 days later, his wife passes away. And so he moves around through the extended family. He lives with George Patterson for a little bit, and then the Franks take him in Warsaw. But he's difficult, to say the least, William W. Patterson. He was too much to handle for the Franks when he was a teenager, so they actually kicked him out and sent him further along the family tree to manage him. We do have evidence from the family archive that he was involved in dogfighting and killing cats in Warsaw. He worked as a clerk for the Frank family in their dry goods store, and eventually moves to Minnesota in the 1850s, where he then joins the Army during the Civil War. And he solicited his cousin to get a commission from Abraham Lincoln. And we have in the surviving correspondence that he is not wildly supportive of his cousin, who he remembers as a young boy dogfighting and killing cats, as being a commissioned officer in the United States Army. But he ultimately does receive that commission, and we know that he receives that commission because there is a duplicate copy of that commission in his homestead application in Buffalo County. Colonel William Patterson, he does receive that commission, is one of the founding fathers of Kearney. He's the one who locates Kearney. He arrives as an agent after the war of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and initially laid out the town of Lowell in Kearney County, which becomes briefly the county seat for Kearney County before it's moved to Minden, and then aids in the establishment of Kearney Junction in 1871. And he is the gentleman who then recommends that his cousin George Frank come out to this new town that he has laid out in the middle of the Platte Valley.
This is the cat killer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And he's buried in the Kearney Cemetery, and is widely recognized as one of the founding fathers of Kearney. And so this is a photo of him from the early history of Buffalo County. So yeah, he grows up, he matures. The war matures him. But it also gives you a sense, again, the kind of work of a historian, right? Like, his homestead record had a copy of his commission from the Civil War, right? You know, you got to kind of look in weird places to find all these things. And so he is able to convince his cousin George, who by this point in time after the war has left and moved to Iowa, and then eventually will come to Kearney. And this is George Frank, okay? And this is George Frank. And then this is Gus Frank here. This is a photograph of the family that we have at the house. George is the little brother. He follows Augustus into the mercantile business, and he runs the business while his brother is in Congress in the 1850s and 1860s. He gets married and will, with his wife is depicted here, and will not participate as a soldier during the Civil War. As a young married man, he's excluded from the draft. He will pay money, as we know from kind of surviving records, he'll pay $50 to kind of the local fund to support enlisted families in the area. But we do know, though, is that both of them will register for the draft, and I'll show you that. And he will eventually kind of outgrow Warsaw. After the war, he moves like a lot of people. He will move to the west, kind of looking for new opportunity, and that's a really common post-war story around here. We have a lot of Civil War veterans in this area. You know, most notably, Gibbon is founded as a free homestead colony by Civil War veterans, and even though he's not a Civil War veteran himself, he still sees this as an area of potential, and so he moves to Corning, Iowa, where he builds a large home. But we have a lot of newspaper clippings and advertisements and things. This is the advertisements for Gus and George's business in Warsaw, New York. Wallpaper, dress goods, carpets, cotton goods, all other goods, down, call before purchasing. We have a lot of other kind of information about them during this time period. Here we have, this is from the paper. This is Gus reporting on what the draft quotas are in 1863. So there's not enough men to join the army. Not enough men are freely enlisting, and so Abraham Lincoln institutes the draft in the middle of the Civil War, calling up a lot of young men who had otherwise not participated in the fight. And wealthy men like the Franks could pay someone, if they were drafted, could pay someone to serve for them. And we don't know exactly if that's what happened, but Congressman Frank does come up to New York and reads out the draft expectations for all of the towns in the county, and Gus and George both do register for the draft. We do have that surviving record from, here's Augustus Frank, and then here's George W. Frank, 31, and he's listed as a mechanic. He's not a mechanic, he's like an engineer. He's also not really an engineer, but that's what he's listed as. And then his brother is listed as a merchant. And as the war progresses, Augustus Frank gets really close with Abraham Lincoln. Again, he's one of the leading politicians from a major Republican state, also a state that has a not insignificant Democratic contingent yet. And we have some surviving evidence on what their relationship looked like. Congressman Frank gives a interview with, there's a painter who paints a portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the White House. It's the famous portrait of Abraham Lincoln sitting, and he's kind of got his head on his hand. That's in the East Room of the White House. And this painter writes this memoir after the war about what it was like living in the White House in the middle of the Civil War, painting this painting. And he talks about his conversations, Abraham Lincoln's conversations with Gus Frank. So he obviously talked to Gus at some point in time. Augustus Frank replied to such reports were always exaggerated and spoke very warmly of Salmon P. Chase's great services in the hour of the country's extremity, his patriotism and integrity to principle. Salmon P. Chase, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, is not always a supporter of Abraham Lincoln. He's a much more radical Republican and at times wants to supplant Abraham Lincoln, possibly running against Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And so Abraham Lincoln makes him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so this is part of the conversation that's being had about whether Salmon P. Chase is lobbying behind Abraham Lincoln's back. And Augustus Frank says, no, Chase really, really likes you, to which Abraham Lincoln, the tears instantly sprang into Mr. Lincoln's eyes. Yes, he said, this is true. We've stood together in the time of trial, and I should despise myself if I allowed personal differences to affect my judgment on his fitness for the office of Chief Justice. So we get some sense, again, this is a secondhand account that Gus is telling the artist who's then publishing it in the book, but we get some sense, right, that Abraham Lincoln is a trusted friend, that Gus is a confidant that Lincoln can go to, that Lincoln is crying in front of Augustus Frank. Which then brings us to his role in the 13th Amendment. When Abraham Lincoln determines that he wants to pass the 13th Amendment, that he wants it done before the new Congress is sat in 1865, the lobbying very, very quickly begins. And if you've seen the Steven Spielberg film, you kind of understand what this process looked like. And we have some interesting accounts of how this goes. It's introduced, but they still don't quite have enough votes. And so we have one of the clerks from that Congress giving us an account of what the passage and the lobbying for the 13th Amendment was like. A systematic canvass was inaugurated, seeing to that there were enough votes to pass the amendment, and again was called for action. Under the immediate charge of James S. Ashley of Ohio and Augustus Frank, they made plans and executed the campaign, keeping their own counsel as the progress was made, never mentioning how this or that representative would vote, but summoning to their assistance such members of both sides of the House politically as they deemed best. It was a quest and an effective canvass. And so Congressman Ashley and Congressman Frank are working side by side, not telling anybody what they're doing, canvassing the entire Congress to see who could vote for the 13th Amendment, okay? They're beginning to take the census. They're collecting this data. Who do we need? Whose arm do we need to twist? What can we do to get this passed? When ascertained that the member who would have voted against the amendment at the previous session would certainly vote for it on the next roll call, either Mr. Ashley or Mr. Frank would come to the desk where the clerk was sitting, as he tells us, state the fact to Mr. Shearman or myself, when Mr. Shearman would unlock the drawer, take out the precious tally sheet, and place a yay check next against the name. Quietly, this work went on for several weeks. Probably Mr. Ashley, Mr. Frank, Mr. Shearman, and myself were the only persons who ever saw the tally sheet. Had anyone not in the secret got a hold of it, what it would have meant would have been unknown. So this is the problem as a historian when you're trying to document the secret lobbying for the passage of the 13th Amendment. There are 4 people who know about it, right? Gus isn't writing this down so that we can't then figure out what the story is. And thankfully, we have one of the participants telling us exactly how it went. Now, that tally sheet, specifically, and I don't quite think that this is the tally sheet, but we do have a surviving tally sheet for the 13th Amendment that belonged to the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, which this is at the New York Public Library. And we do have a list of the numbers of votes, okay? And we see here Augustus Frank of New York, he was the 37th yes vote for the 13th Amendment. And they are able to ultimately cajole enough and convince enough congressmen to vote for it, to vote to end enslavement, which then results in this document. Okay. And in the middle of the document is Augustus Frank right here. And as the paper will tell us, to 2 Republicans, in particular, does the nation owe a debt of gratitude to James M. Ashley of Toledo, Ohio, and Augustus Frank, they held the laboring oar. Now that's what the press tells us. That's what the historical record tells us. What Hollywood tells us in the Lincoln movie, this is James Ashley. He gets a starring role in the Steven Spielberg film. Augustus Frank does not. Right? He is intentionally excluded from this conversation. In the film, it is projected as if it is just James Ashley who is convincing everyone, who is twisting arms. But what we know from the historical record is there is another gentleman who should be included in this story. And so I've got some, unfortunately, though, there's not a lot of substantive evidence to kind of talk about this again because it's a secret process, which is infuriating. But we know that Abraham Lincoln respected the work that he did. Okay, that he understood what Gus did, the lobbying that Gus did, because at Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration then, in 1865, which was held at the Patent Office, which is now the United States Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., it's part of the Smithsonian, Augustus Frank is one of the hosts of the inauguration. Now that is quite an honor to be one of the hosts of the inaugural ball. Right? That is only being given to you if you have done significant work to the president and you are also considered a respected member of Congress. But we also know how the story ends. Right? Abraham Lincoln does win re-election in 1865. Abraham Lincoln is able to pass the 13th Amendment. Abraham Lincoln begins that second term in 1865, but then we know is tragically cut short in April. And with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, we see this turning point in the Civil War and in the history of the United States. And on April 15th, 1865, the news of the assassination reaches Warsaw fairly quickly. The city closed all of its businesses, all the bells tolled, and everyone was called to the Methodist Church to mourn at a meeting that organizers to mourn what the organizers of the meeting called the terrible and heart-rending calamity that beset this nation in its final hour of triumph of our arms on the battlefield. Across the community, the homes were draped in black, flags were lowered to half-mast and fringed with black. After the town settled into the pews, it was agreed that Augustus Frank should be the one to give the eulogy. Frank shared his insights and his memories of a figure whom shared the warmth of a personal friend. As reported in the paper, Mr. Frank, on taking the chair, spoke of the personal character of the deceased president, of his sublime faith, steadfast purpose, pure integrity, and the universal gloom occasioned by his sudden death. Speaking with the warmth of a personal friend and acquaintance, and as one who enjoyed unusual facilities for knowing the great work performed by the president, i.e. passing the 13th Amendment, as well as his spotless character as a man and statesman, Mr. Frank's remarks were full of sad interest. This is also the difficult thing about being a historian. We have a secondhand account of what Gus Frank says. We don't actually have what Gus Frank says. Right? This is a friend of his giving a secondhand account 4 years later, unfortunately. But Gus is given another tragic and mournful honor as he is one of the congressmen invited to accompany Abraham Lincoln's body as it makes its way from Washington, D.C. to Springfield. He joined the funeral train carrying Lincoln's body as it passed through western New York and was laid in state in Buffalo, which just is kind of the historical oddities or connections. There's another member of Abraham Lincoln's funeral retinue who is connected to Kearney, and that's Lloyd D. Forehand, who was the street commissioner in the 1890s, who was one of the honor guard for Abraham Lincoln on the funeral, and he's buried in the Kearney Cemetery. After the war, George Frank and his brother continued to be involved in local business, but George decides to move to Iowa and then eventually comes to Kearney at the insistence of his cousin, William Patterson. But Gus remains involved in politics. He serves in multiple constitutional conventions in New York in the 1860s and in the 1890s. This is a photo of him for the Constitutional Convention in 1867, 1868 in New York. And then continues to be involved in Republican politics. He has the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, come to Warsaw to give a talk, and Augustus Frank is the one who invites him. And the family's fight for abolition continues. That in 1894, when he's on the New York State Constitutional Convention, he advocates for the inclusion of women's suffrage in the state constitution and proposes an amendment to include that, which is ultimately, unfortunately, defeated. He also continues to advocate for the veterans of the Civil War. He supports the creation of and leads the effort to build the Civil War Veterans Memorial, which is in Warsaw to this day. It's in the traffic circle that's in front of the Frank's house. And then this is the Methodist church where the town gathered for Abraham Lincoln's funeral in 1865, where Gus spoke. The statue is decorated with cannons that were captured from the Confederacy. And I do believe they're there. I don't think they were melted down during either of the Civil Wars. And then when he dies in 1895, the Grand Army of the Republic gives him a full military funeral. Even though he was not a soldier in the battlefield during the Civil War, they understood his close relationship with Abraham Lincoln and his fight for the end of slavery. Now, that might be the end of the story. That's a really fascinating story. But Gus Frank also is an ardent supporter of his little brother's efforts to build a community out of the prairie in Nebraska. And so this is a lovely letter. We have a number of Augustus Frank letters at the house that are just kind of a fascinating insight into his later career. And this is a letter to M.A. Brown, the editor of the Kearney Hub. I notice in the Hub the gallant fight you are making for Kearney's interests in enlarging your canal. I cannot see why any citizen or taxpayer or in any wise interest in the city of Kearney and its future growth and prosperity could think of a moment of doing anything other than voting to enlarge the canal. I look upon the canal as key to the future prosperity of Kearney, giving the city as it would the greatest water power in the state of Nebraska. So the canal is something that his little brother had been supporting, had led the capital for, and the city was in the process of passing a bond to expand the size of the canal, which the George Frank and with Augustus Frank's capital had built a little power plant on, which is, NPPD still operates an iteration of that. The other important thing in this letter is he renews his subscription to the Kearney Hub. So always an advocate of local journalism and supporting the community. And Gus would make regular trips to Kearney. Okay, we know this when Gus dies in 1895. There's a large obituary that runs in the Kearney Hub talking about Gus as a dear friend of the city. Owing to the large interests of the deceased in the city and his positions as a financial backer of the Frank Improvement Company, this announcement is of peculiar interest to Kearney people. He is also well known personally to many of our people, it having been his custom to visit Kearney once a year. He was a man of superior business qualifications, was prominent in financial and political circles, and was held in the highest possible repute by many thousands of people throughout the country, as well in his native state. So Gus Frank is coming to Kearney annually from the time that the Franks get established here, and he's the one who is directing Eastern Capital at his little brother to develop things like the streetcar line, the power plant, the cotton mill. All of these things that we think about when we think about the history of Kearney, when we think about the 1890s, right? George Frank is here, but he is facilitating a lot of the work that his brother is doing back east, connecting with the banking interests, the railroad interests, and the other things that he has. And appropriately then, for this kind of continued interweaving and relationship with the history of Kearney is in the early 20th century, when the city of Kearney decides that they would really like higher education in town. And they decide that they're going to build a university, and they solicit support from the state for the creation of the Kearney State Normal College, Kearney State Normal School, the property upon which the old administration building sat, where Werner Hall sits now. Among the deeds and the titles that we have for all of that land in the archive at the university is this document, which is a deed from Augustus Frank's widow for the land where the university now sits. So this is a figure who was very, very involved in the history of Kearney, making regular visits to the city of Kearney, investing in its future. Upon this land, we would eventually build the administration building and the very foundation of what UNK is today. And so we see this story of this family, this family of abolitionists, this family of financiers, this family of politicians who transformed the nation. Without Augustus Frank's lobbying of members of Congress, and in particular the New York delegation, the 13th Amendment wouldn't have passed. Slavery wouldn't have ended. The end of the Civil War might have had a different tenor and tone. Okay? But unfortunately, this is a story because of the secretive nature of lobbying and the historical record that survives that is very, very fragmentary. But it's a very, very important story, and it is deeply interwound both to the history of our community, the history of the G.W. Frank Museum, and then as well as the history of University of Nebraska at Kearney. So with that, thank you, and I will happily answer questions. Who's got the first question?
What's the name on that wagon? Go back a slide.
Oh, it's kindergarten. That's the first school bus. So those are the little kindergartners that, again, because the normal school was the teachers, right, is normal education. It's teacher education. So those are the first group of young kids that our students at UNK were teaching. In a very modern school bus on 25th Street when it's mostly dirt and horse manure. Because this is approximately, this is a Solomon Butcher photo. He's probably taking this photo approximately where the big UNK sign is there before the roundabout on 25th Street. Gene.
I was just wondering how many people in here had classes at the building.
Oh. Every day we kind of, I know it got real bad towards the end when they had to condemn the auditorium, but boy, do we miss that building.
What was the age difference between the two brothers?
I think it's like 6 years. So, because, yeah, Gus dies 1895 and George dies like 1906. And they're both buried in Warsaw in upstate New York, in the kind of Frank section of there. And then there's George has a son, Augustus Jr., who is also very involved with a lot of the financing of things here in town. And if you've ever heard the story of the Frank house, he's the one who, when they begin to lose all their money in the 1890s, who disappears. And they find him in a hotel room in Omaha, surrounded by bottles, dead.
We were at a meeting the other day, and I thought it interesting that Lincoln was the first president to be embalmed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because they moved him from Washington D.C. back then and on.
Mm-hmm. And his Abraham Lincoln's preservation, correct, is the first president who's embalmed, because the funeral train is going. He's laying in state in Boston and Baltimore and New York City and Chicago and then eventually Springfield. And then later, there are a group of ne'er-do-wells who try to steal Abraham Lincoln's body. And they remove the body from the tomb and they bury it in the basement. And they do double check the body before they rebury it under about 20 feet of concrete. And the embalming was real good. There was a little boy who died in the 1960s who was the last person to look at Abraham Lincoln's face because they opened up the coffin to double check and he was still looking pretty good. But now he's under like 20 feet of concrete, so not gonna be able to get him.
And they buried Abraham Lincoln with the flag because it's the pieces of red and blue flag.
Oh, yeah. They buried Abraham Lincoln had a flag on him when they buried him, and there were remnants of it when the final time that they opened up the coffin. Yeah. If you haven't been, go to the tomb in Springfield. It's well worth the trip. It's a fascinating cemetery.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you all.